Hello and welcome to another episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at this Lima J50 locomotive that's been sent to me by Ewan. Ewan has sent it in as it's a port or non-runner. It's also missing the front coupling. So we're going to give this a quick service and look over to see if we can return it to running order. It looks generally clean, so we'll see what we can do. Here's a bit of trivia for you for those that don't know. Originally, the original Thomas the Tank engine, this one here, built by the Reverend Audrey, was actually based on a J50. How history would have been different in the Thomas the Tank world had the illustrators of the books chosen this design and not a tank engine. So giving this model a battery test, you can see that there's no life in this model whatsoever. So we're going to strip it down and give it a complete service and see if we can return it to running order. Now, working on this model is relatively simple. There is a screw at the front here that you have to undo to release the body shell. The rear is held in place with a clip. Once you undo this screw, the smoke box detail will also come loose as it is a separate part of the body moulding. And as you saw there, as soon as I released that screw, that chassis fell out. And there is the loose part I was talking about. So this is your generic 060 Lima chassis used on many tank engines. They're pannier tank and obviously this J50 tank. I removed the weight there and now I'm going to remove the motor front plate. I'm just going to ease these brush retainers up. These were still in place from the original factory press, so I don't think this model has ever been worked on before. So I gently remove both of the brush springs, just hooking them onto the end of my flat bladed screwdriver, and both brushes fall out, which is good, which means that there's no gunk in there sticking them up. So to remove the motor front plate, you just have to undo these two screws and the motor front plate comes off. And there, excuse me, and there we find the armature and the commutator, which is quite dirty, although it is by no means the worst I've ever seen. So I'm just going to give this a polish up initially with a cotton bud soaked in methylated spirits, like I normally do. This removes a lot of the dirt. You can see there on the end of the cotton bud just how much dirt has come off that. But there was one or two little burnish marks on the copper. So I polished these up with a fiberglass pencil. And then, as normal with Lima commutators, there isn't really a groove between the brass plates. But I do clean that out with a cotton bud. I also remove all this carbon dirt from the inside of the motor plate as well. Again, using a cotton bud, and you can see there just how much dirt has actually come off this model. It looked relatively clean, but there was obviously hidden dirt. So as I said, there's not that big a gap between these plates, but it is worth just scraping them out just to make sure that there's no bridging between those commutator face plates. And that is basically the motor service, pretty quick on this one. It only needed the brushes to be removed and everything cleaned up. So the motor plate is then put back in place and the two screws are reinserted. And these screws are tightened up just gently enough to hold the motor plate in place. You don't over tighten your screws, especially metal screws in plastic housings. Now I'm just going to give the brushes a wipe over. There's not much on these at all. They look to be in relatively good condition and have got a lot of life left in them. So the brushes are put back in. There is a nodule on the top of the Lima brushes where the spring sits over. This faces upwards. I place it back into the motor housing and then put the spring back and then refold the keeper plate back over. I'm going to put a tiny dot of oil on that brass bearing there where the motor shaft spins through, and then using a battery to test across the terminals, this motor is now running nice and sweetly, and it's actually quite a smooth runner for one of these. I'm now turning my attention to the back of the motor, and I'm going to be removing the drive cogs. There's a lot of fluff and dirt accumulated on these, so I remove this pin that's held in place by that plastic clip, and then remove these two drive cogs just to give them a thorough cleaning, to remove any fibres and hairs that are wrapped around the gear spindles. Again, using the cotton bud and meths, I just clean all the spindles up, clean the gears, and then reinsert the gears, having lubricated the shafts. I also give the gears a wipe over. There's not much dirt and grease on these. In fact, this model was relatively dry in the lubrication stakes. There's not much on it at all. So everything was cleared up, cleaned up, all the dirt was removed. You can see it on the end of the cotton bud there. The gear spindles were given a smattering of silicon grease, just to provide some lubrication for the gears. And then using a pair of tweezers, the small gear goes on the bottom and connects with the driving wheel. The large gear sits on top and makes sure that the gear engages with the worm gear on the motor. And then that retaining clip was pressed back into place. As I said, this goes through a plastic clip and then just sits on the gear spindle there and holds everything in place. So once that's manipulated back into place, it is a bit of sprung steel, so you will need to manipulate it with a screwdriver there like I did. I just test to make sure that the gears have engaged properly, and then again a quick battery test to make sure everything is seated correctly and just to spread that lubrication around a little bit. And then I'll turn my attention to the wheel sets. Now, to remove the wheel sets, you remove this base keeper plate, the few screws there. And this allows this, or the middle wheel there's a floating wheel, and it allows me to remove this wheel set as a whole. And this allows me to clean up the chassis and the pickups. Now, the chassis was quite dusty. The pickups themselves aren't too bad, just normal general wear and tear on them, a bit of black fluff, as is usual with a model of this age. So this was polished up, get the brass all nice and shiny again using my fiberglass pencil. With all the brass being clean, obviously it allows for good electrical conductivity between the wheels picking up and the motor. So once that's all been worked on and I am satisfied with the brass has been fully cleaned, I'm now going to look at cleaning the wheel backs. The wheel backs obviously need to be cleaned, they press on the brass pickups, and then I'm going to clean the wheel treads themselves. Now, a bit bizarrely, one wheel on this J50 has got a traction tyre on it, only the one. I had a look at the tyre was in good condition. It wasn't showing any signs of cracking, so I left it where it was. I didn't want to replace things unnecessarily. And also, to get the traction tyre off, you'd have to remove the pin that holds the side rod in place. So for ease of maintenance, I just left that traction tyre in place. Now, the wheels on this model were quite dirty. There was quite a bit of oxidisation on them. So I cleaned them off with a fiberglass pencil and then polished them up with a cotton bud of methylated spirits to make sure that everything was crystal clean. The wheels were then put back in place, making sure that that drive gear on that axle lines up. And there I am just looking at that traction tyre, as I mentioned there. It's in good condition, it's not cracking or anything like that. If there was corrosion, I would have changed it, but there is none at all. The wheels sit back in place, making sure that they are in line with the pickups, and then this floating centre axle just sits in the plastic chassis there. There are no proper bearings on this model. It is the bare basic chassis that Lima produced for multiple models. Once the wheels are all back in place, I refit the base keeper plate there. I didn't bother putting any oil on the axles, as there's no proper bearings and it will just splash about and go back on the wheel treads, which will undo all that cleaning we've just done. So once the wheels are in place, I now give it a battery test, and still no pickup on that wheel, and there's nothing. The motor was dead. So now I'm at a loss because everything's clean and the wires seem to be good. And it was when I was doing that battery test there, I realised the battery was getting warm, which was an indication of a short circuit. Now, I mistakenly thought this floating axle in the middle had two insulated wheels on it. It doesn't, it only has one, so it has to go in the correct way, otherwise it will short out the model. So after I'd changed the wheel over, because I'd put it in the wrong way, the chassis then burst into life and proved to be a nice solid runner. So now that's done, I'm going to replace the weight there into the chassis. It fits into a hole there. Sometimes on Lima models the weights will show signs of Mazak rot, but this one was okay, there was no signs at all. So attention now to the body shell, which is just going to get a general clean up. There's not a lot to do on this. I mean, the detail on this is relatively basic. I'm not sure why the smoke box was done as a separate piece. Maybe somebody can leave a comment below. Did the J50s have two different types of smoke box? But once it was put back in place, the body shell was reattached to the chassis, first by engaging that clip in the rear, and then pushing the chassis up and then re-securing that screw we took out earlier on. It took a little bit of fettling to get the holes lined up, but as soon as they were lined up, the screw there was reinserted. It didn't help that the smoke box was loose, because every time I moved it, the smoke box would move and misalign the holes. So now that's all back together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through my spares box to see if I can find a front coupling for the model. And there are a couple of marks on the side there, so I get a bit of warm soapy water on a blue cloth just to wipe the sides a bit and see if I can get some of the marks off. But it appears that there's a couple of marks that are actually embedded into the plastic. I don't believe this is a paint finish on this model. This is actually a black self-coloured plastic model. It's unfortunate, but if I go too hard, I'm going to end up removing the transfers, and I don't want to do that at this stage. So now the body and chassis have been reassembled, I'll give it a quick battery test to make sure that no wires were snagged, etc. And it seems to be running relatively well now, considering it wouldn't work at all when we took it out of the box. For its age, the model's not too bad. I mean, it lacks detail, but for a basic starter loco, these J50 locos, they run on a relatively rugged and reliable chassis. And like I said, for a cheap loco to get people started, they are quite good. And they do have a lot of character, these locos, with their sloping front tanks. And Thomas the Tank Engine could have looked very different had the model producers, and indeed the book illustrators, gone for this sort of tank engine instead of a E2. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com. We'll have a look at getting it sent over, repaired, and who knows, it may even feature in an episode all of its own. Due to this model being DC only, I've set up a loop on the table out of the Midnight Freight set that we did before, and the J50 is happily merrily running around with a couple of mainline Mark 1s. Thanks again for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.